Well, thank you all for being here. I'll turn on my mic here. And how's that? I'd like to thank the archive, the Standard, Humanities Montana, and all the individual people for inviting me. And I'm honored to be here as a writer. So I had some themes I thought I should introduce and mute, and I can see I'm preaching to the choir because one of my themes is group survival. And so I write a lot about animals, and as a veterinarian in Montana, and I thought what I wanted everyone to learn today was how wolf became dog. How humans merged with animals, domestic species in particular. And so 400,000 years ago, people started emerging from Africa, animals as well. I guess it was the Neanderthals 100,000 years ago, perhaps. I may have some of this terminology wrong. That were wandering around. They made it to Asia. And they shared a niche there on the steppes with wolves and grazers of the plain, caribou-type animals. And as the humans began wandering around the continent, trying to survive in groups, no man or wolf could survive alone, or horse, so they took up with this group survival project, which people would be quite familiar with. Wolves were herding the ungulates of the steppe in Russia, much like wolves herd or shepherd elk in Montana. They followed the elk around, they took care of the stragglers, they ate them, they shepherded them, they kept the herd strong. As the humans started wandering around, a clade of wolves became interested in this batch of group survivalists who were going around. And a certain type of wolf, a more curious one, and more one amenable to how humans behave, broke away from shepherding the caribou and reindeer up there and started shepherding and following groups of humans as they wandered around. We think it was the Neanderthals first. And as the two species observed one another, they could see that they were quite similar. They shared a variety of social constructs. They worked together. To survive and pass on your genes in a group, it's not the biggest, toughest, strongest one that necessarily passes on their genes. It's the most attentive, communicative, and appeasing, I want to add, individuals that seem to fit in with the group, communicate effectively, try to work together, and those are the ones that are passed on. So here we had a group of wolves, and as the humans could observe, they were working together, much like they were. Different family members had duties, there were leaders, there were teachers, there were learners. So as this went on, these wolves started eating perhaps the hunting remains of the people. Soon the people noticed that if they paid attention to this clade of dog wolves that was following them, they could learn what was going on around them. And so one of the first roles of dogs merging with human was this protective role, this notification. So the people would know if there were, and the humans were predated upon. They were prey animals as well as hunters. So they began to appreciate that they could have a sense of safety if the dogs notified them that lions or tigers or some force that might disrupt their group was in the area. So approximately 30,000 years ago, these groups got a lot closer to one another, and we think the children and women had a lot to do with it. But pretty soon the wild dog was invited in from the cold, and the humans through time had many of opportunities to perhaps domesticate or merge with other species. In Africa, for example, there were hyenas, there were zebras, but it didn't happen. So it was this shared niche in the Asian continent where they emerged. So some people want to know, well, how did this work with the horses? How can this theory, or actually it's based on science, what I'm saying here, have attracted the horses? Well, the horses were a prey species as well, and they began to sense a certain clade of horses, a curious clade, that here were two groups surviving together, and here they were surviving together, and that they found that if they hung around these humans and dogs, things were a little safer. The predators were sort of cleared by the humans and the dogs that emerged. And so next thing we find, we have evidence of this, that these horses had came and merged. So here we had three groups of group survivalists merging as one. And really that's the origins of civilization right there. Without this concerted effort with a variety of groups, we may not be here today as we are. So certainly horse and dog facilitated safety and propagation of the human group. And so they were able to accomplish a lot more to survive rougher conditions with the merging of these animals. So it was a willing merger. Humans didn't go and capture wolves and tame them into dogs or horses. It was as much the horses and dogs idea to come together. But only certain animals fit this construct, ability to merge with humans, and it's the species who are most like us, who share our social values and strategies to survive as a group. So I can see, that applies here, how all the groups imbued together worked to survive, and no one, really could accomplish much at all alone. So the way I usually best give lectures and talks is to open it up for discussion, what I presented, and sort of follow through, and we'll have an interactive lunch here. If anyone has any questions, I can go on and hold forth about this.
Talk about you mentioned the horses in Butte and the 1895 tragedy, the explosion, and talk about that, the learned behavior and the result of it.
Sure. So some of the things we share with dogs and horses is the ability to teach and learn. So humans, horses, dogs have the ability to teach others, and once these two species or three got together, I think dogs were involved in this episode as well. But at one time, I'm not sure, we were going to look up here in the archives the population of horses compared to the population of humans. But with these hills and stuff, horses were a valuable commodity and were indeed responsible for all the drayage and transfer and transport, everything that vehicles are doing right now, the horses were doing. And I teach equine behavior and horsemanship and dog training as well. And so the key is that if a dog grows up knowing it's a dog, and we find this socialization is critical, that for humans to merge with the dog first has to grow up as a dog around other dogs. Otherwise, we have these dogs that have behavioral problems or unwelcome behaviors. Horses, likewise. An orphan foal not raised by horses is very difficult, if not impossible, to train. So a foal has to grow up fully knowing it's a horse and being trained to learn by its mother in the herd, before humans, who have this natural ability to merge with horses, innate ability, can train a horse. So the dog has to grow up to be a dog, as taught by other dogs. The horse has to grow up as a horse, as taught by other horses, and the humans have to grow up as a human, as taught by other humans. And if that's the case, because of these shared social constructs, we can train horses, we can merge with them. And provided we do their bidding, they are happy to do ours. So they will become willing partners, provided we understand the nature of horses and dogs and fulfill their needs. They are there to please us and to appease. And so that's why we have horses here in Butte and not zebras or some other species. Zebras didn't have the sugar. They didn't work together like horses, and their survival strategy was just mass numbers together, not necessarily carefully orchestrated groups. And so that really didn't fit the human construct. So here in 1895, we perhaps had more horses than people here. And the horses were willingly fighting fires. In wars, of course, horses willingly rode soldiers into war. And as well, it was said, the piece I heard on the local radio station was that these horses were cared for very well. Well, that doesn't really need to be said, because if they weren't, they wouldn't have done the people's bidding in the fashion that they do. So apparently, somewhere down on Iron in Utah, there was a storage shed held by the people who ran the show here, the leaders, the owners, the Copper Kings. And there was some sort of fire started in this building. And so the fire bell went off. Well, you've heard of Pavlov's dog. In Butte here, we had Pavlov's horses. Most of the horses, the best horsemen, were thought to be the firemen. And they were the ones most reliant on horses. If you didn't have horses to pull the fire wagons, things would burn, people would be in trouble. We had to mine and all that. So here we had a town full of happy, willing horses. They were merged happily with the people. They'd been taught to do the people's bidding, and the people kept the horses happy. They kept them inundated with fringe, forage, and locomotion, 3 requirements of horses. And this fire went off. Well, a lot of the fire horses were trained young as they sort of reached a certain age, and this had to do with horse trading as well. They would be sold off and then be used as drayage horses, or horses, taxi horses, carrying around carriages, other things. Well, as the fire bell went off in this building, all the horses, through their learning like people, had been conditioned when the bell rang, the fire bell, that they would all head to the fire. And so most all the horses in town, the fire horses in particular, but also the horses that were carrying people around and hauling stuff, were always attracted, it appeared from reports I've read, to go to the fire. They willingly, happily, stride towards the danger so as to quell the danger. So apparently, many of the horses in town, along with the people they were pulling and carrying, and perhaps the dogs, showed up, and then there was some trouble with the fire, some misjudgments, it said, and the dynamite then, after everyone had arrived to quell the initial fire, the dynamite somehow exploded from the firemen chopping in there with the axes, fighting like they would a traditional fire where dynamite wasn't stored. So there were some subsequent explosions, and so it wasn't the first animal or human tragedy in Butte. So this history of animals and humans, we went hand in hand and threw this all together. These days, there's not a horse in sight. There's dogs around. I had to drive out of town really to find any horses. So that's the story of how the humans and horses merged in Butte to sort of facilitate this expanded group survival, and how in this particular instance it backfired a bit. Yes?
I have a friend of mine who considers herself a bit of an animal activist, and she has a perspective that dogs are our slaves and we should not have dogs. Do you have any thoughts on that position?
Well, I disagree. There may be some instances. So the first dog people in this continent were the Native Americans who had walked over the Bering Strait from this land where the dog was domesticated. So they showed up, and so from what we can understand and appreciate scientifically, it involves some interpretation, and perhaps we're not completely clear. But the dogs, it was their idea, and they found the merger is beneficial, and they may not have survived, and humans we may not be here if this thing hadn't happened. So we feel that the dogs were willing participants, and the people accurately appreciate the nature of dogs and horses. They can live together, and it was sort of evolutionarily destined to be. So I am an animal welfarist. So what we do find, the biggest problem I see is, the reason I'm giving this lecture is to help everyone understand about animals, but to understand the nature of how we merged and what the parameters are. And so dogs and horses who are guardianed by people who know how to keep dogs and horses happy, these people have horses and dogs that are happy to please them. So it's a mutual mutually beneficial arrangement. So when it's orchestrated in that fashion, like perhaps Native Americans do it, then I don't consider it slavery. And furthermore, we don't like this idea, this doesn't work out, this indentured servitude. A horse is not an indentured servant, because indeed, if the horse so chooses to have the last word, the horse will take it. And so at any given time with a 1,200-pound horse, if they perceive and they appease, and that's their nature, is to, okay, if that's what you said, that's fine. But if it goes too far, and they will draw a line, and so they aren't indentured slaves, and that training strategy doesn't work. So, we try to please the animals, and then they are happy to please us. That's their nature, that's our nature. We've seen how slavery works on several levels, but certainly today some people, sociologists, compare human slavery with how we keep horses now, and some people make that analogy, that horses are slaves, and there can be something said for that. As race and entertainment animals. Yeah, the saddest show on earth was recently curtailed. Yes?
Yeah, I saw that.
Have you had many dealings with mules?
Mules? Yeah, a mule is like a horse, only more so.
And they have a mind of their own.
And so the reason a mule is like a horse, only more so, is because the mule had this teacher, and this teacher was a mare. And so mares taught mules to be how they are. They have some genetic influence from the donkey, but the donkey didn't raise up the mule, the mare did. It doesn't work the other way around. You don't have a trainable animal if the donkey's the mother. So you have to be much more patient, much more aware, and so indeed it requires more appreciation of equine and mule behavior. Horses are easier to train and more willing to merge, and the reason dogs and horses merged with people is because these species form strong pair bonds. So if you go look at a field of horses, they will be paired up. All of them will have a partner. Sometimes there's triads, sometimes there's loners. Same with the wolf pack. So this affinity to form strong pair bonds was the reason why the dogs and horses moved to us, and they will switch out this bond, a dog in particular, a horse part of the time, where they will bond with someone other than their own species for a period of time in the case of the horse, 24/7 in the case of the dog.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, the horse wants to go back with the herd of horses. The dog is happy to bond exclusively with the human, doesn't need other dogs,
Right.
but it's imperative that the dog is first raised up by the litter. We don't like them taken away at 6 weeks and isolated from their species. We want them to grow up now 4 or 5 months in the litter, really get this picture of group survival, and then those dogs are ready-made to show up with the people and do their thing. You know. But they need to learn that from their own species, yes.
What about the unhappy horses in the mines?
Yeah, so I'm not familiar in particular, but certainly that was great cause for animal welfare concern.
Yeah, that was.
And so I don't know the extent of but any horses that were, Iceland's biggest regret is that they don't allow any imports for 1,000 years. It's been a herd, no horses have went to Iceland, but they exported them to the mines in England, and when they went over there to see how they were doing, they were devastated, and they considered it. So indeed, because horses are appeasing and willing and can be taught, they can be abused as can dogs, but they're willing servants to a point, some more than others. And then of course, as time went on, one of the definitions of domestication is selective breeding. So they bred in this docility, and they bred out these ones that bucked people off and so on, and weren't cooperative. So through selective breeding, we even dumbed them down more to do as we said, and so animals can easily be commandeered with negative consequences to them by people, and that's the history of mankind, and it's one of the reasons I'm here, is to sort of soften that interface. Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about what you mentioned last night about, it was empathic connection, or?
Yeah, so in order for animals to survive in groups, they have to communicate effectively. And the way animals communicate is not verbally like I'm doing right now, but with a gesture language. And so wolves can understand and communicate information, as can horses, between one another with body movements. They use some vocalization, but primarily it's gesture language. And the term I'm putting forth is kinetic empathy, language of movement, to transfer information, you know, with your body movements rather than birds. So all human animal trainers and dog trainers, whether they acknowledge it or not, they should be aware of it, that the animals are reading their body language extensively. And so when we do train horses and dogs, we try to be consistent and, you know, and speak the same language with our body. And so, you know, pretty soon any horse or dog can be trained to movement rather than voice, but they also, dogs and horses, can respond to words and stuff, and they can understand and respond to specific words. So even though they can't talk back to us extensively, horses can whinny, dogs will howl and bark and whine, as you know. But to carry on a conversation like I am is probably the difference between us. So apparently when the dogs merged with the people, they overtook their sense of smell. They became the noses of the people, the eyes of the people, and so on. And so then that allowed the people to confidently and safely sit around the fire and develop language, because they had the dogs there and the horses. They had fed them and everything. So it's thought that we lost our reliance on smell to a large degree compared to the dog, and then that allowed for some frontal development to do more complicated things like mine and build buildings and so forth. So without the security of dogs surrounding the people around the fire, it is thought that we may not have had the opportunity to contemplate the world and to start spending a lot of time using the cerebral activity rather than this constant struggle to secure food and so on. One of my other themes for thought, I was watching a Sidney Lumet biography, and this thing came up about themes in his films and stuff, and one of them was feed me and then tell me about right and wrong. And so one thing, you know, that all group survivalists, you know, if they're not fed, things are apt to go in directions that may not be moral or ethical. But once everyone's fed, then we can look back, and I think we're all fed here and comfortable, so we can look back and see maybe what we've done right or wrong, and maybe improve. When we improve the welfare of animals, we improve our lot in life as well. So again, it remains a mutually beneficial pursuit. Yes?
Where do horse whisperers come into this communication?
Well, I think the people who were first involved, I don't, it's more of a horse gesture languagist rather than a whisperer, perhaps, and one more who understands the horse. So I think these were people who sort of got the picture that if you knew how to please a horse and that you knew that horses form strong pair bonds, they could use this information to bond with the horse. So to bond with the horse, what I mean is that the horse is extensively familiar with you. The horse can predict what you're going to do. And likewise, you are extensively familiar with the nature of the horse and the individual horse's behavior, and you can predict the horse. So what they want, what a horse wants in a human, is predictability and confidence that, you know, the human isn't going to do something antagonistic. So once a horse gets the picture that you're on their team and then they sort of bond with you, then you have this sum, this combination which is greater than the sum of man and horse. So it's a willing partnership. Horses are making some of the decisions in a horse race or polo match or in a hunting scenario. So the human needs to understand which decisions the horse is better qualified to make than him. And so it's not this indentured servitude concept. It's showing the horse who's boss. You know, that has a place, but if that's taken too far, indeed, the horse will show you who's boss. Yes.
Where does the alpha trait come in? How do some animals have that alpha trait?
Well, we in behavior, we're getting rid of the word because it creates problems for animals. So if someone thinks that you are intimidated by the alpha, they'll use that wrong. So we use the word leader. So the lead mare of the herd, she drinks first, not because she's the biggest, toughest, meanest, because the water hole is the most dangerous place on the planet for the horse. It's where the predators wait. So she goes and risks her life first. And as well, she needs to determine if the water hole is safe and if the water's potable. So we are diverging from the word alpha because people training dogs think if they demonstrate to their pet that they're the alpha, then the dog will do what it says. But indeed, what the human has to do is fulfill and enrich all the natural needs of the dog, and then the dog will do what it is. So we're a little skeptical of the Caesar Milan thing, and we don't like to use the word alpha because it misconstrues what we consider the actual science.
But with dogs, like a 2 or 3 dog household, one will be the leader. How do they know how to?
Yeah, they learn that from other dogs, and some of that goes on. But if there's too much antagonistic behavior in a group of horses or a group of dogs, and there's too much of this visibly alpha behavior, it generally means the dogs aren't fulfilled and enriched, and they have a lot of energy they need to burn up. So as a veterinary behaviorist resolving problems with dogs, 95% of the dog problems I'm presented with can be resolved by 2 one-hour walks a day with the dogs. So locomotion is essential for human, dog, and horse health. And when we don't get what we need, things deteriorate socially. So dogs and horses in particular. So usually when I see a bunch of trouble or a bunch of alpha behavior, it's because the dogs aren't fulfilled as naturally as they could be with exercise and perhaps bone chewing and so on. So that's my response. But of course, this alpha thing has been drummed into people forever, and we think it's a little bit of a questionable concept, as well as this evolution of the biggest, strongest, meanest, toughest. We don't like that either. Both those concepts, if people have them, lead to welfare issues for the animals these people train and manage. So that's our view on that. Yes?
Talk about your views on breaking colts and how it should be done correctly.
Yeah, well, so the friendly way, patiently, and non-coercively. And it requires a lot of establishment of this pair bond. A lot of time spent hanging out with the horse is really not doing anything, just establishing yourself as an individual as them. And so we don't like a lot of punishment. That has its place in training, but generally we want the horse to do the right thing and then be rewarded for it. So it's generally the soft touch. That said, there are times when during training, dogs and horses are punished, but it's really like once or twice a week, not every 5 minutes. So we do like the friendly way, to understand and appreciate the nature and behavior of the horse, and then as well, a lot of these horses are locked alone in a stall and then thought to be trained. Well, the last place on the planet a horse evolved to be is locked alone in a stall. It's contrary to all the horse's needs in nature. So horses evolved to live in a herd and to walk and graze all day long, look at one another, wink their ears at everybody, look around. All day long they do this, and if we take that away from them, their behavior devolves to abnormal behavior. And when we see a mare pinning her ears at other horses in a pen, we know that we failed to fulfill the nature of that mare. that's not normal behavior. So when we take animals out of their natural setting, and horses in particular, grazing around and walking all day, running once in a while, resting maybe 10–20% of the time, and we take all that away from them, their behaviors change and become what behaviorists consider abnormal behaviors. So we're hearing all this trouble that these horses are alpha and they're always fighting. We go in and we go, well, you're not fulfilling the nature of these horses, because if you go to prior mountains and watch horses, you'll see none of this. You'll see no agonistic behavior, very little. Sometimes they fight, but it's usually sort of sparring without contact. But so really, in wolves as well, in their natural settings, they're quite peaceful and communicative, and we don't see a lot of this bossing around. Everyone works together and appeases, but it happens and it's part of it, and I can certainly see how people get enamored with this alpha thing. If I show this horse who's boss, he'll do everything. I'll tell him to win the Kentucky Derby and he'll win it. It just doesn't work that way. It's willing partnerships we see. So things are changing about the way we view animals. I think through this technological age, we've even gotten more distant from them. So now there's a lot of groping to kind of reconnect. You had a question there.
Well, speaking of the Kentucky Derby, I grew up in Louisville, Kentucky, where children learn to read the racing form from their parents.
As
And I
you did.
And could you comment on the racing industry and its ethics, or am I gonna have to go into recovery? Because
Yeah, well,
it's a hard thing to grow up with and feel like it's not okay.
horses evolved to run in close company at top speed. That was one of their evolutionary things. It's their method of survival. So when all this surveillance and group communication fails and the lion shows up, and so if the leader, or what some people call the alpha, is on the east end of the herd, and the wolf shows up on the west end, all the horses in the herd are trained to be the leader, and all the other horses in the herd are trained and taught to follow the horse, giving the orders when there's a crisis developing. Of all things we could do with horses, perhaps horse racing would be the most natural compared to like dressage or cutting or rodeo or jumping. So what they really evolved to do was run at speed in close company in a group. So the horse racing has that going for it to them. So I made this comment that the last place a horse evolved to live is in a stall. And so indeed all the horses at Churchill Downs are in a stall. So if that's the case, what the trainer who wins the most races is the trainer who most successfully recreates the horse's natural state. And what that involves is hours and miles of daily walking. That's the thing that they're most deprived of, deprivation of locomotion. For horses' lungs to develop and hooves to stay healthy and metabolism on even keel and gut to work, they require this constant movement. Everything is dependent on moving 2/3 of the time. For a horse, to walk is to breathe, to run is to breathe, to walk is to have digestive function, to have hoof health. So all that needs to be taken care of. So when you lock a horse in a stall for 23 hours a day, his lungs deteriorate, because lungs, the pulmonary health is dependent on abundant daily locomotion. Well then, if you do that and you run the horse hard, they have this tendency to have this medical problem of bleeding into the lungs. So then my profession found this drug, Lasix, this diuretic, that if you lock horses in a stall 23 hours a day and race them and they bleed, you just have to give them this drug a few hours before they race, and it will suppress that side effect of inappropriate, inadequate husbandry. So therefore, this medicating racehorse, creates substandard horsemanship. And so I think that's the biggest problem. Before passing judgment and telling you about right and wrong, I went to other countries and places and observed how horses are cared for, and these places where these drugs aren't allowed, Lasix in particular, these horsemen have to get out and walk those horses for 4 or 5 hours every afternoon. Well, yeah, that's a lot of time and labor, but it's what the horses need. And the horses are therefore much happier, much more willing to race, and life at the racetrack is much better for them. So in America, and it's the horse racing industry isn't the only vulnerable party, you know, we become sort of dependent not only on technology but on medication. And so we've sort of become this pharmaceutical society, and the animals I think are suffering from that, and so I really think they just need to make the racing clean. It's what everybody wants. In Hong Kong, it's clean. And you should see the amount of money people will bet on a horse race if they think that, and it's demonstrated to them that the racing is clean and there's not a bunch of hanky-panky, particularly with drugs. So horses are extremely vulnerable to medication. You can give them nearly anything, and they will run faster. It's sort of almost their flight response if they detect some, you know. So it's just incredible what people will attempt to do. And you know, the circus was a similar thing. So it's now over, the Ringling Brothers Circus. Elephants, one of the definitions of domestication is control of breeding. Well, we can't control elephants breeding, not humanely, and it's not very well done. Once in a while you get this report out of India that this elephant, you know, went on a rampage. It's too confined, so they're almost too big to keep. So all elephants actually are born in the wild, and in this case, and so some people don't consider elephants domestic species, they are so socially similar to people, elephants, that without selective breeding, we can take their young after they've been raised up a ways and taught how to learn by their mothers and commandeer their life. An elephant is an exception in the domestication because we don't control breeding. All the other species that are the general 13 or 15, we control the breeding extensively, and so each generation they become more docile or more amenable to our needs. Racehorses, though, we're breeding for flight and speed, whereas draft horses and a lot of these horses that were here were bred to do as the people say and don't give them too much grief about it and just relax. And so we had this sort of docile horse in these minds, you know. These horses weren't interested in racing and running too much because that angle had been, you know, discouraged with selective breeding. Yes? Yeah, go ahead back here. Yeah, Green Bay.
You mentioned the prior mountains a little bit ago, and so now I have to ask you your thoughts on the current situation of the wild horses in the West, where we have room on the wild horse ranges for about 23,000, but we have over 100,000 wild horses, supposed wild horses. Heaven forbid we ever slaughter anything. That all the animal rights groups want to keep every one of these wild horses alive, and so now we're forced to pen these horses all around the West, not on wild horse ranges, but in pens we rent for them. Adoption of wild horses is down. Attempts to sterilize them on the range has really been minimal. Where's that all going?
So we talked about group survival, and if any group overpopulates itself and the population exceeds the resources, the entire group is likely to die. So in the steps where horses evolve, as long they form these extremely complex social groups, which were so similar to the human social groups that there were these evolutionary things that controlled and managed the population. So naturally occurring horses with unlimited resources will naturally monitor their population, and they won't overpopulate. This is in a perfect world, perhaps. If you want to, if you go in with helicopters and round up 8 separate groups of wild horses that had established their social groups, they usually have groups of 20 or so, and run a train through that and separate and take the leaders and separate all them, and what's left over, the ones they didn't round up, are socially dysfunctional and therefore overpopulate. So the cause of the horse overpopulation is the interference of unknowledgeable, immoral, unethical people who didn't take the time to understand the nature of horses and how they operate and how they manage their own populations. If only you allow those social family units, we don't call them harems anymore, to operate as they long evolved to operate. So part of the reason there's so much overpopulation is all the disruption. So I can round up wild horses by myself with a helper and a Confederate horse. We almost did it at Wingshire, but to round up a wild horse family unit in an intact unit and then deal with it would be a better approach. So if you get on a horse, and these horses were all once previously domesticated and selectively bred, you can get on a horse and ride towards a herd, and they'll run away from you, and you can ride further. And in 4 or 5 days, you can be part of the herd on the fringe. And in 12 days, you can start guiding this herd, and so you can bring the family unit in intact. But if you use helicopters, everything's going to get mixed up. So there is the science and technology to round up horses in a humane fashion, but they aren't utilizing it and they're not utilizing science in a lot of areas, as David and I have been discussing. So that's my response. So in Iceland, there's no unwanted horses. There's not one. They're a horse culture. They have a saying there that it takes 200 years to become an accomplished horseman. So we can tell that. So really no one's allowed to say. So they eat their horses, but they slaughter them in a humane fashion where the horse never knew what came. In America, they tried to, I just explained how critical this social group is, and if you go fracture it. So as long as horses don't become troubled in the process of slaughtering, I'm not one to tell people which meat they can eat, which they can't. That's not my position. So in America, though, the society was too insensitive to the nature of horses, and they weren't able to slaughter the horses without troubling them, and they severely troubled them. So took a look. Whereas in some areas, they can slaughter horses in an ethical fashion, but Americans weren't able to pull it off. We were too callous and misunderstanding, and World War II seemed to really change the way people thought about animals somehow, in my view.
What can we do though?
Education.
Because my hand went up for the same question. It's kind of a problem.
The overpopulation of horses.
Wild horses.
Yeah, well, they could start rounding them up in a proper fashion and not this helicopter fashion. At least they should attempt that. I mean, there's people who can easily do this. It takes a little bit of finesse and horsemanship, but they can be brought in a more humane kind way. So it's just this man trying to coerce the animals again and trying to, really without considering the nature of the animals, do their bidding. And so that's the history of mankind, is inappropriately coercing animals to do our bidding, and it's just another example. I suppose there's going to have to be some culling of some sort, but it's a complex issue, but I don't see that they have the right people addressing it, and that bears out because it doesn't seem to be getting any better, it's getting worse, and so they need to try something different than that's already going on.
Talk about your experience on the branding crew and your horse string and all that. I thought that was really interesting because it speaks to how you came to be who you are now.
So my uncle married the widow of Arlington Rankin, Jack Gull, married Louise, and things got better for him. He all of a sudden was married to the biggest landowner in America. They raised cattle, and I still think ranchers who operate properly probably maintain diverse habitat, compared to farmers who turn a diverse piece of land into a monoculture. But so I was fortunate enough to be raised. My father was a horseman and veterinarian, and then I was also raised with the Blackfeet Indians. So the Indians, they had this thing where you have to work with the horse rather than try to be its boss. And so I sort of had the picture. So when I got to the Galt Ranch when I was 13, my dad sent me 3 well-trained, nice quarter horses, so I had a bit of advantage to start. But as time went on, the Rankin ranchers were raising their own horses, and these horses would come into our herd. So each one on the branding crew, I hate branding, but that's what it was called. I can't believe that our society hasn't come up with a more humane method to identify animals. But anyway, we had these 3 horses, and I talked about this pair bond, and you know, these people who go to catch their horse and can't catch the horse, you know, kind of funny to me, because the reason, you bond with the horses, so it's a communal effort, and you want the horse to enjoy the work too. So one of the horses in my 3, I'd ride a different horse every 3rd day. He would come out of the herd on his day, every 3rd day, and be waiting at the gate. So he found more pleasure every 3rd day bonding with me and spending the day with me than staying out in this natural setting with the herd. So then you know that the training has become a good deal for the horse. And to get back to your horsemanship question, that's the whole crux of it, I think. As long as you make the training a good deal for the horse and the husbandry associated with the training, they're a dream and easy as pie to train, and it's why they merged with people and why it was such a long-standing relationship. So they're made to bond with the person, a horse is. Evolutionarily, it was convergent evolution, specifically. Yes?
One comment and one question. Temple Grandin says it's imperative for dogs to be able to seek.
To what?
Seek.
Seek?
Yeah, just like the horses walking around.
Yeah.
Yeah, but my question was, every year, or it seems that you see a new pedigree of dogs, combination pedigrees. Do you think all of the selective breeding is doing the dogs harm?
Well, there is a movement now, and they're criticizing the Veterinary Association, and so now, finally, I mean, a lot of vets knew this a long time ago, like bulldogs couldn't even be born naturally or mated, so here we really made it artificial. So now there's a movement, and there's people telling other people that it's wrong to breed certain types of dogs because you're just setting them up for a lifetime of failures and medical issues and behavioral problems. So indeed, really it's run amok, the domestication process. There's other areas though where it's working great, but animals are always subject to inappropriate problems with people. Yes?
Do animals have personalities?
Oh, yes. And they think and feel, and really, I used to hear these things, oh no, they're just a conditioned response, everything they do. Yeah, no, we all know, and because of these animals that have merged with us, horses and dogs in particular, I think we can validly anthropomorphize, and many of us who've been raised with horses and dogs concede that really a lot of their cognitive functions are quite similar to ours. And then there's huge varieties of personalities just like people. Yes?
More of a generic kind of animal question. As we look at the increase in human population, we're at 7 billion now, quickly heading for 9 billion. I guess by 2070 we'll be at 9 billion. Paralleling that line is the extinction rate of other animals on the earth, which leads me to the conclusion that humans really are the worst species ever to set foot on the planet, because we are responsible for extincting so many species, and that's just going to continue. What are your thoughts on
Too
that?
bad they're not horses in their natural setting, where they control their own population, innately almost. These horses are cognitively saying, I look like the grass is getting a little short here, we better lay off the breeding season, but something influences them. So all I would say is, well, humans should look at these examples where animals became overpopulated, whether it was from human influence or some other issue, and see the consequences. So, overpopulation, results in disease and a variety of other things. So there's some inherent checks and balances that will eventually catch up if we don't decide to monitor it in a more appropriate fashion. But who's to say you can't have a child? You know, so it gets really complex ethically and morally. But indeed, something's going to give at some point, and so probably disease or famine or something will result in a check. You know, so, there'll be a die-off.
My kids think I'm crazy because I keep wishing for a human pandemic.
Well, they're creeping up, and we're reading a lot about it. A lot of fear. Yeah, the microbe has the last word. The horse has the last word. The microbe has the last word. Yes.
I just wondered a little bit about things like, I know people that have, like, let's say, therapy dogs, or, how dogs have kind of been now known to, let's say, sniff out disease and that sort of thing. How has evolution over time, like, I guess, contributed to, I guess, breeding dogs or training dogs to do things like that?
Well, those were things that they did before we merged, this smelling out of disease. Like, so now they got the dog in Canada smelling out the superbug, C. diff. And reading my notes and preparing this, it was specifically noted, some scientists speculated that indeed when the humans merged with the dogs took over these certain things like smelling out pathogens and trouble, which the humans had to do to survive, and so then the dog commandeered that. And without the dog, the humans were more vulnerable. So that's why the merged group survival worked. So I think most of the stuff they end up utilizing dogs and horses for is going backwards rather than forwards as far as the genetic selection. I think, our problem is with a lot of dogs is a lot of the sensibility and innate things are bred out of them, and they therefore become more unwelcome pets and exhibit more unwelcome behaviors. Yes?
This is a really strange question, but
No.
should I feel flattered because the little neighbor dog came to live with me after my old dog died last summer?
Well, it's the whole merging coming all over again. The dog was keeping an eye on you next door, saw what you were up to with your dog, saw the other dog passed away, and commandeered this thing. And furthermore, I don't know who the neighbor was, perhaps that at your place, life was more fulfilled and enriched. More raw bones, more engaged activity, and so he shifted over. And as well, we think that they sensed this empathy, this that you were sorrowful and needed, and so I talked about the pair bonding. And so you became a more attractive candidate to pair bond with than the other owner who become taking up drinking or whatever.
Yeah, well, he finally gave up because she kept escaping and jumping out the window and everything else. So he, brought over her certificates and stuff. I give up. But yeah, anyway. So do I have to worry that she's gonna move on down the street?
I didn't hear that.
Should I worry that she's gonna move on down the street?
No, as long as her life remains fulfilled and enriched with you, she will have no urge to seek, accommodations elsewhere. Yes?
Many animals' breeding behavior is determined more significantly by certain keys, including fluctuating hormone levels in their systems based on whatever it is, daylight,
Yeah.
or so on, as opposed to humans, where sexual activity has much less influence by those kinds of things.
Humans were able to commandeer their environment for a long enough time to where they had secured enough resources on a year-round basis to have children year-round, whereas horses and cattle and wolves, the only time of year where the resources were available to raise a family was the spring, or the bountiful time. And so that would be one way I'd answer that. And then the humans with dogs and other cows, they've bred that seasonality out of them, but not with horses. Horses still remain seasonal. Yeah, they are regulated by the length of day. So right now is their least fertile time. They're not even cycling, the mares, but they'll start soon as this heats up. And so then ideally they would be bred in June or July and full in May or June, and that's the most successful, that's the most likely time for the offspring to survive. And so that has evolutionarily, but some species, you know, and it went on, as time went on, they evolved and adapted, and so apparently the humans were able to secure resources on a long-term basis because of our big prefrontal lobe here, and then therefore that over time. So at one point in time humans may have been seasonal, but I think they evolved in an equatorial place. That could be another explanation, where basically it was the same all year round, whereas the animals who evolved on either end, where it was more seasonal, their hormonal system set up to succeed. You know.
Now, if you take, say, a captive herd of red stags or elk or whatever, you take the young and transplant them into a similar environment, but in a different, in the southern hemisphere, do those animals
swap?
Is something, can they change? Can they adapt to that?
Well, when we move horses, we breed horses, and horses, you know, selective breeding with horses took a long time. You know, you always heard about the mares getting out and getting bred by the wild stallion and so on. So they didn't get as genetically influenced as others, but if we breed horses in North America, and then it's a mare, and we move her to South America, her cycles change. They flip-flop over a period of time. And so the time frame does alter. Whereas they were most fertile in the spring, they are now most fertile in the fall when they live in Chile. So they are totally influenced. And so then we can artificially mess with the light here in Butte, and we can have horses cycling right now. We put these little things on them, and it makes it light, you know, as if it was spring, and so that we can fool their systems with photo periods and make them cycle early. So we can artificially manipulate that, knowing that their hormones are influenced by the length of the days, in short.
So then, talking about social groups having a propensity to control their numbers.
Yes.
Is it that they, do you know, or is it known whether they breed as much but the embryos don't implant, or some other factor?
So if the female isn't, in horses in particular we see this, if they're not gaining weight each day, if they don't have a certain amount of body fat, indeed they are infertile. And we think that happens with wolves. If the population, the resources have been limited, the elk herd has been removed, or the bison, and so nutritionally, this may be one of the major reasons that the populations don't continue to expand in rough times when the resources are limited. And so we think that's a big factor. We also observe, though, that there's behavioral factors that somehow evolved where you know, mating isn't allowed, pair bonding between fertile mates is discouraged within the pack through this communication system, and maybe a little alpha stuff where someone goes and lays down the line, but it's just that the alpha thing isn't a prevalent issue. It's mostly cooperation, and one day out of 14 there's an alpha event of some sort where